On November 13th, 2020, Arthur Keith died as a result of an officer use of force. This incident happened at the Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority, the King Kennedy complex near Halt North Walk and Bundy. CMHA police officers were dispatched there on a report of an individual with a gun. The person who called 911 indicated that he had seen that person there before on prior occasions shooting off a gun, and he was confident that that individual had a gun today on that particular day. He also gave a description of the vehicle that this individual was in. Officers responded. It was about 4:40, between 4:30 and 4:40 in the evening on that November 13th, 2020 date. CMHA police officers arrived on the scene. It's my understanding they have jurisdiction over housing authority complexes, and as a result, they were dispatched. They arrive on the scene. 3 officers arrive on the scene to investigate this black Chrysler, for which this 911 caller identified as having the individual with the weapon. As officers approach that vehicle, they see someone moving inside. One of the officers opens the door to that vehicle and sees an individual who was later identified as Arthur Keith in the back of that minivan with a gun. The officer gives commands for Arthur to drop the gun and to get out of the vehicle. Mr. Keith gets out of the vehicle, turns toward the officer, and according to the officer, points the gun at him. At that point in time, the officer fired 4 shots. Mr. Keith was struck once. The bullet went from near the back and under his armpit, cut through a rib, his chest area, his heart, and a lung, and exited out his right chest. After he was struck, Mr. Keith attempted to run. He ran for a few steps and ultimately collapsed. Officers approached him, immediately saw that there was a 9mm handgun within arm's reach of Mr. Keith. That 9mm handgun was set aside. Mr. Keith was handcuffed for a brief period of time till they realized that he was non-responsive and had been hit. Then officers started to perform CPR on him. They called dispatch, immediately radioed for EMS. Officers attempted to life-saving techniques that were ultimately unsuccessful. Paramedics arrived and took Mr. Keith away. The gun was retrieved and analyzed. Mr. Keith's DNA was on that weapon. It was on the trigger, the slide, and the magazine. And as I stated, Mr. Keith did not survive that single gunshot wound to the chest. The investigation was completed by the Cleveland Police Department. They did canvas interviews. They interviewed multiple witnesses in the area. They interviewed the response by the Cleveland Police Department. The Cleveland Police Department has body cams, so their footage was reviewed. The Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority police officers do not have body cams, so the incident of itself was not captured on video or any other recording mechanism. However, the aftermath of what happened was captured on video. A camera from the housing authority captured not the shooting, but Mr. Keith falling and officers approaching him at that point in time. The investigation, as I stated, included reviewing 911 calls, reviewing dispatch calls, radio runs, looking at where the car that Mr. Keith was in, the origin of that, the origin of the handgun that Mr. Keith possessed, and interviewing witnesses. As a result, this investigation was presented to the grand jury, and the grand jury ultimately felt that Officer Griffiths acted reasonably, and therefore there was no bill to that indictment, and the case was not indicted. None of the officers were indicted for any criminal conduct.